right next to mine, so it's great to see you here. And she's done some beautiful work on algorithms of human language in the brain, so really bringing in the neuroscience, LLMs, recordings, and all that. So looking forward to your talk.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. Really enjoying this workshop so far. Had a lot of really interesting conversations. I'm also really excited to share some of my research with you all. So my work is really focused on trying to understand how does the brain do this amazing thing of transforming sensory inputs into a symbolic understanding of what it is that someone is saying or writing. So in the case of speech, what I mean is how does the brain take these fluctuations in air pressure and transform that into a conceptual understanding of what it is that's being said. And it's this transformation from the sensory to the symbolic and how the processing system, i.e. the human brain, achieves this mapping that I'm really interested in. And I'm interested in this both for the case of comprehension, where you receive the sensory signal and you have to extract meaning from that, as well as in the production case, where essentially you're doing that process in reverse. So you start off with the conceptual idea in your mind, and then you have to translate that into sensory inputs. And throughout this talk, I'll probably refer to sensory inputs as acoustics and speech, but this can also apply to visual inputs in sign language or visual inputs in written language and other types of ways that we process and produce language. Okay. So in trying to understand this processing system, the human brain, that transforms sound into meaning, I try and make this big problem a little bit less overwhelming by splitting the system down into 3 subcomponents. So one component here is what are the representations that the brain generates and extracts from this sensory input. So examples of representations might be a time frequency representation of the cochlea, of the fluctuations in sound in frequency over time. Or it might be the phonemes in the speech sequence, or a vector representation of the meaning of a given word. These would all be examples of representations that would be encoded in neural activity to achieve understanding. The second subcomponent of this processing system is what operations does the brain use in order to generate and manipulate those representations. So again, to try and be concrete here, one example operation might be filtering of the input signal within a certain frequency range. So maybe, for example, you want to discard anything in the acoustic signal that is of a given low frequency. Or maybe you apply a nonlinear transformation. Maybe you want to go from something to be, say, linearly acoustically organized to being discrete, that this is a pa sound and not a ba sound. And there are other types of operations like composition and other processes in play here to generate these different representations. And then finally is the order in which these representations get generated and the order in which those operations get applied. And I refer to this as information flow. So examples here might be feed-forward pass of information, or feedback pass of information, or recurrent operations that happen locally in the same place over time to maintain information over time. So I try to organize my research around these 3 subcomponents of the processing system with the idea that if we can understand each of these 3 elements, then we're doing a pretty good job of understanding how the brain processes language. Okay. And I want to make sure that I say this up front, that like right now, is a super exciting time to be doing language neuroscience research. And I think that's true for two reasons. One is that finally we have the appropriate tools like large language models and speech models to be able to actually numerically represent these different hypotheses of the representations that the brain might be using. And secondly, we have available to us very sophisticated tools for actually measuring human brain activity. So let me go into a bit more detail about two of those axes. So this is kind of the candidate set of representations that compose speech, going from the lower level properties of speech, like the phoneme sequence, all the way up to the more symbolic properties of speech, like the syntactic structures and the meanings of what's being said. And we actually know quite a bit about the low-level properties of speech processing, because one, the processing of acoustics is not something that only humans do. Animals also process similarly complex acoustic inputs, and so we've learned a lot about how the auditory system works in humans by virtue of also looking to animal models. It's also very straightforward to be able to actually measure the acoustic signal that is entering into the human ear. There's, and other things too, which has all kind of accumulated to meaning that we know a lot more about the processes at these lower levels than we do at the higher levels. So if we're trying to understand how the human brain processes these higher order symbolic meanings and structures, it's less obvious that there are good animal models that we can turn to in order to understand those processes. And it's also not clear how to actually kind of measure those symbolic properties so that then we can fit models in order to be able to actually investigate them. So how do you numerically represent the meaning of what it is that someone is saying? That's essentially where large language models come in my work, as a way of addressing these two shortcomings that have led to us understanding way less about the higher order processing of language in comparison to the lower level processing. So on the one hand, in addressing this issue that there aren't, that animal models are less helpful in the case of understanding these higher order processes, well, actually we can kind of use large language models as a type of animal model. So we can use them as like example species, like ask them to do the tasks that we would also ask our humans to do, and see how their behavior, in these tasks, and then actually be able to go in and understand on a unit by unit basis how is it that the large language model actually exhibited this behavior. So for the first time in history, as Alex also mentioned, there is a system other than the human brain that is able to exhibit language-like behavior. And that's very exciting because it means that there is a type of animal model that now we can use to run experiments and investigate how language is how language has been implemented in this other system. And they also assist in allowing us to numerically represent these higher order properties of language. So we can, with interpretability techniques, actually extract information from these models that actually do scale with the meaning of what's being said or the type of sentence constructions that are being used. And we can use them as in our analyses in order to actually get a handle on how these higher order properties of language are neurally implemented. So these are the two two ways that I'm primarily interested in using large language models in my work to understand how the human brain achieves language. And we'll see a little bit of this today. So that's the one reason, that's the first reason I'm excited about language neuroscience right now, is because we have these tools available to us. And the second reason I'm excited is because of the technologies we now have to record human brain activity. So in my lab, we use 3 different types of recording techniques that operate at different spatial scales. So we use non-invasive methods like MEG, and we're about to get an optically pumped magnetometer system, which is kind of like a new version of the MEG system. And this is a very powerful technique because you can bring in your whatever participants you want and record neural activity with both spatial and temporal resolution to give you a sense of where the brain is active in your tasks across both time and space. We also collaborate with clinicians to get access to intracranial EEG data. So this is specifically a technique that is used to localize epileptic seizure activity. And while the patient is in the hospital for the course of a week, while the clinicians localize this activity, sometimes they volunteer to listen to our audio books that are the stimulus that we often use in our experiments. And that is a very precious data set because it, again, gives us both high temporal resolution, but very high precision of exactly where it is in the brain that we're recording from with a given electrode. And then finally, a really groundbreaking technology enables us to record lots of single neurons in the human brain. And specifically, I've worked with Neuropixels probes. And here, this gives us the ability to actually analyze how ensembles of single neurons come together in order to form a computational circuit that essentially is the kind of basis with which all the higher order processes come to be. So by being able to analyze neural data from looking at the whole brain on the one hand, zooming in all the way down to a single cortical column and being able to investigate language processing across all of those scales gives us the ability to really make progress in understanding the different, the neural implementation of language at these different scales. So is everyone else excited now too? Okay, great. Okay, so today I am going to talk about work that I've conducted at the 2 extremes of these spatial scales. So I'll talk to you about a couple of studies using whole brain MEG and one study using Neuropixels probes. So first we'll talk about neural representation of how the brain generates this hierarchy of representation which spans from the sensory to the symbolic, like I said. Then we'll talk a little bit about some of the neural computations that seem to be in place in order to sequence language inputs. And here I'm excited because this has very strong analogies to positional embeddings that were kind of in parallel discovered to be very useful in transformer models. And there's a lot of analogies to what we see in the brain. And then finally, we'll talk about how some of these processes actually get implemented at the single cell level. Great. So let's start off with looking at representations of the sensory to the symbolic. So this is the picture that we started out with. So in the speech comprehension situation, the task of the human brain is to transform sound into meaning. And that's actually a pretty tricky computational problem to solve because sound and meaning are linked arbitrarily. You actually need to learn those mappings in order to be able to actually extract the meaning from the sounds. There's nothing natural in those sounds which tells you what those sounds in those particular orders mean. So it's proposed that the way that the brain solves this problem is by taking the sensory input and extracting from that a series of hierarchical representations, where with each step that we take to the right, the representation becomes more complex, more abstract, more like the ultimate meaning of what's being said, and less like the sensory input that was actually received in the first place. So the first question here is, what are the appropriate representations that I should put here? So what representations does the brain generate in order to form this bridge from sound to meaning? And second is, in what order do those representations actually get generated? So maybe you're thinking, well, the order question seems pretty trivial. Surely, okay, the brain takes the acoustic input, and from that then extracts the phonemes, combines those to make syllables, combines those to make morphemes into words, into phrases, into sentences. So the order is trivially going to be from the more sensory up to the more symbolic. The alternative, though, is, well, if you're actually listening to someone talk continuously, like you're doing with me right now, you might actually start to form predictions about what that person is about to say. So it might actually be the case that you know what that person is going to say before they actually say it. Yeah, great. Before they actually say lemon. So in continuous speech, you actually will often have a situation where the meaning of what's being said is actually available to you earlier than the sensory information of like how the person actually said it. So this actually turns into a non-trivial situation in continuous speech, where you might actually have things go in the reverse direction, that the more complicated things are available to you earlier than the more sensory things. Okay, so to address these questions, I recruited 21 native English participants, and I had them listen to 2 hours of audiobooks while they lay down in this very comfortable MEG system. And every few minutes, they just answered a comprehension question so that I knew that they were paying attention and not falling asleep. This actually is one of the biggest data sets of its kind, so I decided to organize it in a organized way and release this publicly. And it's actually been nice. There's a number of groups that have used this data set to address a number of different questions. So if you're on the hunt for a data set yourself, then I recommend checking this out. So we have these 2 hours of audiobooks that these participants are listening to, and I annotated those audiobooks for a bunch of different properties of language, which span from the low-level properties, like the individual speech sounds, all the way up to the higher order properties, like the meanings of the words. And I picked essentially all of the features that have kind of ever been proposed in linguistic theory before, or have been used in NLP that seem to be good for processing language in the kind of algorithmic domain. So there's about 50 features in total, but we can organize them into 6 feature families. So at the lowest level, we have phonetic features, which, as I said, refer to each individual speech sound. Then we have the sublexical properties, like how many syllables are in this word, how many morphemes are in this word. Then properties of the words themselves, like word class. So is this a determiner, an adjective, a noun, a verb? And then properties relating to the syntactic structure, the sentence structure. So, for example, how many branches of the tree can we create at a particular word? How many can we close? And this is how deep into the tree structure does a particular word occur, which is kind of like a proxy of how complicated that sentence is at that point. And then at the highest level, we have our proxy for the meanings of the words that are being heard. And this essentially is where I use large language models, or here is just a single like a word-to-vec glove representation, a glove representation of these words, but there are other words, other representations of semantics that I use beyond what I'm showing here. And this is what allows us to model essentially this top level of the meaning of the words and the meaning of the phrases and sentences that are being said. So we have the numeric representation of all of these different properties of language, and I'm just going to fit a ridge regression to see how well each of these different properties of language are actually encoded in the neural activity of the participants listening to these stories. So I'm going to try to reconstruct these different properties of language from the neural activity. Okay. So just to remind you, one question is which of these features are actually encoded in the brain activity? And second is in what order are they encoded? Is it from the lowest to the highest or highest to the lowest? So just to give you the extremes of the hypothesis space for the order question, just to make sure that we're all clear. If it is the case that language processing works in this kind of bottom-up manner, then in my decoding results, I should be able to decode the lower level properties of speech earlier than I can decode the higher level properties of speech. And then if the reverse is true, then I should actually be able to decode the higher level properties of speech, the semantic vectors, earlier than I can decode the lower level properties. Okay, so let's take a look at the results. So I'm going to show you the decoding on this right-hand side. We have time on the x-axis here relative to when each of those words ended. And I'll show you the decoding of each of those 6 feature families. So kick it off with the decoding of the phonetic features. So just to orient you to this plot, you see that there's lots of lines on this plot. I'm using a stacked plot here. That's because there's multiple features in that feature family. But this bar here is the result of a temporal permutation test, which tells you when in time can I read out this information from the brain activity. So I can decode the phonetic features from about 0 to 200 milliseconds, sublexical from about minus 200 to 500 milliseconds, word class from about minus 200 to 200 milliseconds, syntactic operation from about minus 200 to about a second, and then the syntactic state and the semantic vectors were decodable from about half a second before the word ended until about a second and a half afterwards. Okay. So our first question was, okay, out of all of these features of language that have been hypothesized in linguistics or that we've borrowed from NLP, which of them seem to be encoded in neural activity? Well, actually kind of all of them. Some of them explain more neural activity than others, but each of these kind of 6 families of the hierarchy all seem to be robustly encoded in neural activity. So this suggests that the hypothesized hierarchy actually is a good empirical explanation of individuals processing and understanding language. We also see very interesting things in the dynamics here too. So actually, yes, the higher order properties of speech were encoded earlier than the lower level properties. And I also find that this amount of overlap also really interesting. So there's this entire time window of 200 milliseconds where I can take any just one snapshot of brain activity and I can read out the entire hierarchy. I could tell you that this word ended in a T, that it was a verb, that it had something to do with cats, and the sentence was kind of complicated, all just from one snapshot. And that's not to say that that information is all in the same place at the same time. Actually, it's probably not. But all of that information does seem to be available in the system at the same time. And I think that this has very important implications of how information at different levels can actually serve to constrain one another to help resolve ambiguities that can arise at each of these different levels. So if I pull back then the two hypotheses that we had about order, well, the only hypothesis that predicted this reverse relationship between the hierarchy and decoding onset was the reverse hierarchical hypothesis. And this is it's very interesting that this is the one to win out here, because it's been primarily put forward for visual processing in the past and much less for auditory and language processing. So what this theory has to say for itself in the visual domain is that the lower level sensory input that hits our retina is actually very noisy and ambiguous as to the actual objects that we're looking at or the important aspects of the visual scene. So it's actually a good processing strategy to use the context that we already understand about what we're looking at to guide and bias how those lower level properties are actually processed and interpreted. And essentially I think that the same thing is happening here for the case of speech processing. I'll just finish my sentence and then it's your turn. The lower level sensory input is actually very noisy. There often are other competing sounds, or someone might misarticulate something, but a lot of the time that doesn't really trip us up because we have this higher order context that we can use to help guide how we actually interpret that lower level information. Yeah, question?
By looking at neurons, how can you tell whether they're representing phonetic, lexical, or something higher order? How does the representation work? How do you differentiate different representations by looking at neurons?
I'll tell you how the analysis works, and then you can see if you have the same question. So this is the input to the ridge regression is the activity across the 208 MEG channels at one slice in time. And we're trying to read out, was this a nasal sound, yes or no? Or a separate model is, was this a verb, yes or no? So the ridge is trying to learn the optimal pattern over the MEG sensors to read out that particular property of language. Does the question still hold?
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Yes, please.
Question. So this is sort of averaged out over the entire 1 hour long audiobook, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess sort of like maybe a follow-up question is how long it takes for it to reach the sort of syntactic state, because right now it seems like from the start, before it reaches the word, it already knows what kind of syntactic role it's going to play, what the semantics are, but how long does it take for that to develop from the onset of someone telling a story?
Yeah.
For example, is it almost immediately that you can start seeing that it's predicting this, or is this something that's a bit slower?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So as you rightly said, this is what the picture looks like across the entire 2 hours. But it's not that this reverse pattern is actually present from the first word in the audiobooks. It couldn't be, because the person doesn't know what that story is going to be about, so there's no way to form predictions about what it is that you're going to hear. So actually what we see is that as a function of predictability of what's about to happen, you see a shift in the in this slope. So it's you have to start off bottom up, and then once you have accumulated enough context, then you go from being bottom up slope forward to having it increasingly slope backwards.
Okay. So would that mean then that depending on, let's say, the length of the story, you start seeing more of a shift like this, maybe?
Yeah, right, yeah. So as a function of the strength of the context that you have, you would see that the slope gets steeper and steeper. Yes?
Do all the elements have to be present all the time? I'm thinking of situations of learning, like a child learns a language, they might not know every single word and not be able to parse it, but they understand the meaning very well, or a language learner who has a limited capacity.
Yeah, that's another good point. Yeah, and that maybe actually relates to one of the future directions that my postdoc Jill in the bright orange jumper is working on. So we're following up on this now, actually with a pediatric data set of children at different ages. This is also an intracranial data set, so we can actually get a better sense of where this information is coming from. But yeah, throughout development, we wouldn't necessarily expect all of those levels to be there from the very beginning. And maybe at different developmental stages, some levels of representation are kind of encoded more strongly than others, and they take different amount of time to kind of come online to end up with what I showed you, which is like the mature processing system. Yeah, Alex.
The grammatical features from like MEG data.
Yeah, like what's the effect size? I mean, yeah, not great, I guess is the that's why we collected so much data, is that the amount of variance you're actually explaining in the MEG channels is pretty small, but it is reliable. And so, yeah, like statistically speaking, it's way better than chance, but in terms of the percent of a signal you're explaining is pretty low. One thing that we didn't do that I've started doing from now on is getting strict repeats of the same input so that we can compute a noise ceiling. So we at least know how much variance is possible to explain, and then kind of work backward from that, which I think is a more realistic picture of the actual effect size, is kind of the pragmatic effect size. Yes?
There's some features that are more explainable on that hierarchy.
Yeah.
Like the lower ones or the higher ones, or just kind of following the line.
Yeah, it essentially kind of drops off, like as you get further and further away from the sensory input, the effect sizes get smaller and smaller. But it also, there's a number of reasons why, and like one is that also the actual neural code gets more and more distributed. So then if you're trying to explain activity on one given sensor, then you're not going to do as well, but it is just because that information is distributed across sensors. But that's actually why I used a decoding, like multivariate analysis here, where we're putting all of the sensors in one go to allow for the model to learn, regardless if it's a distributed or local code.
That makes sense.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I am really excited about this direction, and I'm excited to further leverage large language models to get a better handle on the processes at this highest level of the semantic and also like structural properties of language. And this is kind of our, where we are right now, but I'm excited to further this along. Okay. So the second study that I wanted to talk about is about sequencing information over time. So when we're listening to someone talk, or also when we're reading or viewing sign language, the information gets presented to us in a sequence, and often we actually need to make connections between words that aren't next to each other. So being able to appropriately keep track of the order with which information's come in and be able to compose that information is a really critical process to be able to understand language. And I decided to just start with the punchline, which is, and what I'm about to show you, I think it's a very interesting case where in parallel we discovered something in the neural data which actually aligns quite well with positional encoding, or specifically rotary positional encoding that we see in transformer models. And I'll go, once you see the data, you'll see more clearly where that analogy comes from. But I was excited to see this kind of independent convergence of what we see in the neural data with computational strategies that have also been extremely productive in the engineering domain. Okay, so this is the picture that I showed you before. And here I have my little cartoon neurons next to each of these levels. So one kind of dominant theory has been, okay, well, for a given property of language, you're going to have an assigned population of neurons that encodes that information. So you'll have one population for the phonetic stuff, maybe a different population for the sublexical stuff, et cetera, et cetera. But what I wanted to test in this study is the idea that actually maybe there's not a one-to-one relationship between the neural population and the feature that it encodes, but actually maybe different neural populations come online as a function of time. So in this schematic, what I'm showing you is the neurons that are a little bit darker are the cartoon of which neurons are encoding, let's say that this is a verb. And in this schematic, the neurons which encode a verb here are overlapping but slightly different to what happens later in time, and then it moves over here, and then it moves over here. So as a function of time, the neurons that are encoding that this is a verb is actually changing. And we could model that by looking at the MEG data that I just described to you. As I said, we're trying to learn the optimal pattern over the MEG sensors that reads out, let's say, if it's a verb or not. And we can just look at how similar is that neural pattern as a function of time. So if it changes, what we should see is that the decoder that we learn at one latency in time actually is only informative for for a small window, and then the neural pattern changes, and then it changes again and changes again. So the information is present for this entire duration, but the actual neural ensemble in which that information is encoded is different as a function of time. Do you get it? And why would that be a useful computational strategy? Well, it's useful because it means that you can maintain the information of a given property for a long period of time, while also allowing new inputs to come in without them interfering with one another. And it also gives you the benefit that you have essentially a neural time code. So you code the amount of elapsed processing time since this process begun by virtue of if you're in the A ensemble or the D ensemble. So which ensemble you're in tells you how much time has elapsed since you started that process. So you get the relative time, which gives you also relative position, and it allows you to maintain information while also allowing new inputs to come in. Yeah, question at the back.
So if you have multiple sensory audio input, say both are words or something like that, is it processed in a separate section?
They're both going in your ear at the same time?
Yes.
I would love to do that experiment. So the timescales that we get from the analysis I'm going to show you actually makes very strict hypotheses about which latencies, if they both entered your ear at the same time, which latencies would confuse you and which latencies would be totally fine. So I'd actually love to run that psychophysics study to see if the behavior kind of bears out with the timescales that we see in the neural data. Okay.
Is it tracing?
Okay, so this is the hypothesis that we're testing here. And I used the same data set that I described to you before of this audiobook listing. Yeah?
Going back to the previous slide, is it fair to call the neural time code a memory or something similar to memory?
I guess it serves some similar functions that memory serves, but I'm not sure that I would call it memory proper, because it does allow you to maintain information over time, which is a type of memory, but there's no you're not kind of shipping it off elsewhere and then kind of bringing it back, and it has a very strict time period that wouldn't allow kind of you can't kind of drop it and then pull it. It needs to it's just going to remain available for a fixed period of time. So we use this same audiobook listening data set, and as I told you, we had annotated these audiobooks, but in addition to the annotations I described for this hierarchical level, I also annotated the position of each phoneme in the word, such that we can reconstruct the sequences and see how these sequences actually get sequenced. So we have the annotations of the phonetic features, but crucially as a function of where that phoneme occurred in the word. And the analysis is essentially what I described to you through that cartoon. So we're going to learn the optimal pattern of activity at different latencies relative to when the speech sound begun. And we allow it to learn whatever pattern is most informative at that latency. And then we evaluate the accuracy of each of these patterns at all possible other latencies in time. So if it's just a simple one-to-one mapping between the feature and the neural pattern, this is just going to be a series of generalizable squares. But if the pattern is actually evolving, then we'll see that kind of diagonal shape that I showed on the cartoon. So here is the data for decoding the phonetic features of the first phoneme in the word. For simplicity here, I'm just averaging the results of the features together, so we just get one plot. And the way to read this plot is that we begin to be able to decode the features of the first phoneme about 100 milliseconds after that sound began. And we continue to be able to read out that information until about 450 milliseconds. But any given pattern of neural activity that we learnt is actually only informative for an average of 80 milliseconds. So what that means in practice is that the neural pattern here is different from the neural pattern here, different here, different here, different here. So as we hypothesized, as a function of time, the neural pattern is changing. But all of those neural patterns are informative at that given latency. So that gives us evidence for this evolving neural code, which we see both for the first phoneme of the word, but also for the second, for the third, for the fourth, for the fifth, as well as the last phoneme of the previous word, working backwards as well. So all phoneme positions seem to share this dynamic coding scheme. Yeah. Yeah, so they're highlighting that there's this kind of appendage that actually you can read out the properties of the first phoneme of the word actually before that phoneme happens. It overlaps with the previous one. And yes, I think it's about anticipating what the next word is going to be. And this is something that I'm looking into further. Yes. Okay, so this gives us a number of processing advantages. So if I just highlight for you a horizontal slice, you see that there's essentially no overlap in the neural pattern of one phoneme and its neighbor by virtue of the fact that the neural pattern has changed by the time the next sound comes in. And I think that this is exactly what stops the brain from getting confused about it's processing multiple sounds at the same time, but never using the same pattern at the same time for multiple sounds. And I think that's exactly what stops the brain about getting confused with these rapid inputs. And if I also highlight a vertical slice here at half a second after the word started, we kind of confirm that we can read out the history of the previous 3 sounds that that person heard, but also not just what those sounds were, but the relative order with which they entered the ear. Because we know by virtue of what this pattern is, that more time has gone by for the first phoneme as compared to the second as compared to the third. And so essentially that gives you a running trigram representation of the last 3 sounds. And that is a very good computational unit to actually derive higher order structures like word identity. Yes?
At what level does the anti-causality happen? You said that there is some anticipation that takes place. This is at the phoneme level?
So yeah, if we split the data up into if you could predict what that sound was going to be and you couldn't, there's changes in the dynamics that you see, but that's not really what I'm highlighting here.
Okay, one of you we can talk about it.
Yeah, Lona?
I'm wondering what, like different phonemes have different lengths, and
yeah.
How does that affect your plot?
Yeah, so different phoneme lengths. I also messed with the speech rate a little bit, like imperceptibly, but enough that I could split the data also into shorter and longer phonemes, but by virtue of the speech rate manipulation. And what happens is that these diagonals get thinner and pointed more upwards. So you traverse the same trajectory, but you do so faster if the sound is faster, and you do so slower if the sound is longer. Yeah.
How are you computing the extent of the envelope? Is there like an accuracy threshold?
Yeah, like these contours. Yeah, this is, like a T. Yeah, it's like with a statistical threshold. It's the same threshold across all phoneme positions. But it drops off very dramatically. So even if you give a very liberal cutoff, which, yes, it makes the contours larger, you still don't really see much overlap in the neighbors because it essentially goes down to chance level at the point that the contours would theoretically overlap. Okay, so that is the link here to this positional encoding, which is the idea that you essentially rotate your vector representation of that given, in this case, phoneme, in a predictable way, such that the direction of that vector tells you how much time has elapsed since that process began. And so this solves the tricky problem of having to explicitly code for ordinal position in the sequence. Instead of having to do that, all you need is the relative position, in this case relative to like what came before and what's about to happen. And by virtue of having that relative positional code, that gives you enough information to disambiguate one structure above, in this case what the morphemes are or what the words are.
The rope encoding is about tokens in the transformer, whereas yours result is about phonemes. Do you think the same principles would apply at the higher level of linguistic structure?
Thank you. So yeah, is this like a weird phoneme thing, or does this also apply to each of those hierarchical levels? Well, actually, at every hierarchical level, we see evidence for this same rotational dynamic. As you might also observe, which goes back to Alona's point too, that the larger the unit that is being encoded in neural activity, the slower that information actually kind of traverses this space. So another way of putting it is that the information evolves as fast as, but no faster than it needs to, such that there is an overlap with the next unit that comes in. So just to make that concrete, like by lexical here, I mean part of speech, and the average width here is the same as the average duration of the words in the stories. So I could make that same sequence plot for the words, and you would see the same kind of phenomenon. Yeah, so thanks for pointing that out, Anya. That for rope in transformers, we're looking at tokens, but it seems that indeed that does generalize across all of the levels of the hierarchy here. Okay, great. I think I said that. Okay, any questions on this part before I talk about single neuron implementation?
Like, is this going to come back to what you talked about like the chaining of each one of the phonemes in time? Now we're going to, because that's my question is like, what does that look like in the brain? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, not exactly. Okay. But I can tell you what like the implementation hypothesis would be, is that you would have redundancy, that different neurons code for exactly the same thing, but they do so at different latencies. So like their receptive field would be identical, just with a temporal shift.
And like spatially, you see them in the same area.
Yeah. Yeah, so in what I'm about to show you, I'll show you evidence for redundancy, but I don't have quite so clear the shift in the temporal lags. One thing I'm working on now, though, which I'm not going to talk about, is we also have single unit data with Utah arrays. And we're collaborating with the team that they have in the Utah array implanted in the inferior frontal gyrus, so like a higher order area. And there we actually do see redundancy of lexical features with this lagged temporal code. So even within like this tiny little like patch of cortex, if you redo the analysis I showed you, you still see this like diagonal, even within like a very focal area, which I'm pretty excited about. Okay. Okay, so as I said, in what we've talked about so far, we've been in whole brain world. And now we're going to zoom in on a specific part of the brain, but be able to actually record spikes of large sets of single neurons in the human brain. Okay, so for this, as I said, we can't record the whole brain, so we need to decide where it is that we're going to record from. And we chose to record from an area called the superior temporal gyrus, which is a kind of higher order auditory area, which has been very implicated in speech processing. So it seems that neural populations in this brain region encode the, for example, phonetic features that we've talked about a lot, but also fluctuations in loudness of speech, onsets from silence, the pitch of someone's voice, and relative changes in the pitch of someone's voice. There's a lot of speech features that are encoded in this area. And we actually know a lot about how this encoding looks and kind of the XY coordinate along the surface of this gyrus. But what we really don't know anything about is how this kind of encoding comes to be by virtue of the neurons, which are organized in this laminar structure underneath the surface. So just in case this isn't kind of common knowledge to everybody, the brain has gray matter on kind of the surface, which is about 5 millimeters thick. And the gray matter is organized into 6 layers, where there are different types of neurons in each of those layers and different connectivity structures. And up until now, we haven't been able to investigate in humans what the neurons are doing at each of these different layers relative to the surface. So that's what we're going to investigate here. So one hypothesis is if we were to record all of the neurons in this cortical column, so across all of these cortical layers, we would actually just see that all of the neurons are doing the same thing. So if the kind of sensitivity at the surface says, oh, this is a nasal area, then all of the neurons underneath would all just be coding for nasal sounds. That's one possibility. An alternative possibility is that actually in one cortical column, different neurons are actually tuned to different speech features. Maybe there's some that like nasals, but others like prosody, and others like fluctuation in loudness. And maybe those neurons are actually organized by virtue of which cortical layer they live in. So that's what we're going to address. One, which speech features are encoded in single neurons in this area? And 2, how is that encoding organized as a function of cortical depth? Okay, so how do you record single neurons in humans? So that's where these Neuropixel probes come in. So these probes have been really transformative for work in animal models, because for the first time they gave the ability to record hundreds up to thousands of neurons at the same time, organized across cortical depth. And I actually have a dummy probe with me if anyone wants to see what this looks like. Because it's like the probe is this line that is too small to be rendered on this screen. It's like impressively tiny. Yeah. So my postdoc work was dedicated to safely translating this Neuropixels probe to be able to use it for use in humans. So this is specifically done in the case where someone needs a brain surgery to remove cortical tissue, either to treat epilepsy or to treat a tumor. And we insert this Neuropixels probe into the tissue which is about to be resected. So any nominal damage caused by the probe becomes moot because that tissue is removed anyway. Yeah, we record for about 20 minutes while we, in this case, ask people to listen to spoken sentences. So we had 8 people volunteer to take part, and each of these dots shows you the location of the probe insertion for that given individual. And here is the structural MRI for the first participant. And this red thing is a schematic of the probe. And you can see that the probe is actually longer than the gray matter is thick. And so we insert the probe so that some contacts are in white matter and some contacts are in air, so that we're certain that we're spanning all of the cortical layers. And because the tissue is being resected anyway, it means that actually we can perform histology Nissl staining on the tissue that the probe was inserted to try to get an estimate of the relationship between the electrophysiology and the actual anatomical layer that neuron came from. So I'm going to, okay, we're a little bit short of time actually. So I'm going to, you can ask me for demonstrations afterwards. So here are some examples of the neurons that we recorded. We recorded from about 700 in total, so this is just a subset. But here, each row is a different neuron, and each column is a different sentence that that neuron is responding to. And here, some of these sentences we repeated 10 times, and that's what you're seeing here is the same sentence with the neuron responding to that same sentence just kind of stacked on top. So you can get a sense of how consistently this neuron fired every time it received the same input. So you can see that here, for example, the neuron fires very consistently at the same point. I mean, it almost fires exactly the same number of spikes every time this sentence is played. But you also see that precisely when it fires is different depending on which sentence it's hearing, suggesting that it's actually coding something specific about that given sentence. So to figure out what speech features these neurons are encoding, I fit a linear temporal receptive field model, which I'm going to skip this part. I have noticed that we've been a little bit flexible on time, but I don't want to take advantage. So I have this temporal receptive field model where I have the hierarchy of speech features that have been proposed to be encoded in this brain area. And now this is an encoding model. So I'm trying to predict, will this neuron spike, yes or no, as a function, of which of these features just happened in that sentence. So we have our friends, the phonetic features, fluctuations in loudness, the pitch of the person's voice, whether that particular word was stressed, the probability of that word in the sequence, and the probability of that phoneme in the sequence. So we can figure out which of these features best predicts if that neuron is going to fire. And that's what I'm showing you on the right-hand side. So you have the depth of the probe on the y-axis. Each of these dots is a different neuron. And I'm coloring in the neurons to tell you which of these features best explained if that neuron was going to fire. And the x-axis is how good the encoding model was. So you can see a few things here that I want to highlight. One is that some of these features are much more frequently encoded than others. So we see that a lot of the neurons encode the pitch of the speaker, and a lot of neurons encode the phonetic features. And we also see a number of neurons that encode the fluctuations in loudness too. But you might also see that these neurons aren't just kind of randomly scattered around. That in these particular subjects that I'm showing you, we actually find that the neurons which encode pitch are encoded more superficially, so in higher layers, than the neurons which encode the acoustic phonetics. So bringing this together, it means that in one cortical column, no, the neurons aren't all tuned to the same thing. They're tuned to multiple speech features, but they're also not just randomly scattered in like a salt and pepper fashion, that certain features tend to localize to particular depths. Okay, so yeah, that's what I said here. So we have heterogeneous tuning within a cortical column and depth-wise organization. But obviously this comes with the larger take-home message that this technology enables us to answer questions about circuitry in the human brain that was never accessible before. And this is what I'm really excited to further, that we can also try to investigate these processes, again, not just at the lower sensory levels, but move this up to try and understand how those more symbolic properties of language actually are encoded at the single neuron level. Yes?
I'm curious, how often you find that either one concept is only, one phenomenon is only encoded in a single neuron in no other neurons, or one only encodes one phenomenon and nothing else? Or how often are there overlaps?
Yeah, so it is multiplexed in both directions. So I simplified the story here, but for one neuron encodes multiple things, but it does have a dominant feature, but that's not the only thing it encodes. And similarly, that same feature is encoded in multiple neurons.
And are there like rare exceptions where like spatial neurons or?
It comes, so this work has the caveat that we're severely subsampling the neurons. So even if you did only find one, it's hard to say if you would just kind of got unlucky. So I think time will tell. I think if the sparsity of a given feature gets replicated multiple times, then maybe I would be more comfortable making that kind of claim.
Right.
Okay, so I'll just wrap this up, and then I'm happy to take other questions, time permitting. So just to give you a sense of where we're going with this, I'm really excited about better understanding the symbolic operations that enable language understanding and language production, and using large language models through interpretability techniques to be able to actually get a sense of what information is being encoded and how it's being encoded. And one of the things we're working on is looking at the types of symbolic representations that are actually shared across different models, and then test those features to see if those are encoded in brain activity. I'm very excited for the potential of large language models for helping us better understand the computations at play. So I think we have a pretty good understanding of the representations, and representations are kind of easier to get a handle on. But I am hopeful that with these techniques in hand, we'll be able to actually understand better some of the underlying computations. And I'm also excited to see if we can have a resurgence of spiking neural networks now that we actually have empirical kind of ground truth that we can compare those networks to. And I'm excited to try to push this forward to see if we can use that as a basis for building more biologically inspired speech models. So with that, thank you all. Thank you to my lab, and I'm happy to take questions.
Time for a couple of questions, and then is Alan? Yeah. Oh. Okay, great. Maybe do you want to start setting up one of the questions?
Oh, yeah.
Question kind of related to a point that Kyle brought up this morning in his talk. Where he talked about the difference between studying neural patterns and then studying neural implementation. Kind of like the analysis that you were doing, it's supposed to, if I understand correctly, ridge regression, which tells us, do we see the same kind of higher level, symbolic? Do language models or these kind of numerical representations and the brain encode similar concepts, but in the kind of work you presented today, we weren't able to see it implemented in
Yeah, yeah. I think that in what I show, we're not quite there yet in terms of that actual granularity. But that's one of the things I'm very excited to kind of push forward. I think that there's also the idea that maybe you actually haven't derived exactly the right feature, but it's sufficiently correlated with the right feature that you still kind of get above chance decoding in this case. And I'd also like to kind of push that forward so that we can actually discriminate how far away the right answer is from what we're observing.
Do we have time? Yeah. Very impressive work. For the first experiment with MEG, I was wondering if you found some effect of hemispheric lateralization, if that differed at different levels of representation. And then for the second experiment, I was just wondering if you recorded from the same hemisphere in all patients, or if that was very
Yeah, good question. I did not do a hemisphere split in the first MEG study. That would be interesting to look at, though. I've done that a bit with just looking at the lower phonetics and comparing that to musical tones. So there's a very clear hemisphere split. But I didn't do that here, but it would be an interesting to look at. For the Neuropixels single neuron work, one of the patients actually, it was right lateralized, even though the language is left-sided dominant, and there wasn't much difference to observe. like we saw the same type of features being encoded, that I think that that's another case where we just need more data to be able to make systematic comparisons.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And next we have Alan, who's